For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to StratNewsGlobal, and welcome to this special series on China. As you're aware, China is marking the 72nd anniversary of its founding as the People's Republic in October 1949. And you will recall we had the first of our series last week, where we interviewed General Rakesh Sharma on China's Cultural Revolution 2.0. Today we are looking at another aspect of China. This is in relation to China and Afghanistan, or more specifically China and the Taliban. And I have with me Dr. Raj Varma. He teaches at Huaqiao University in China, in Xiamen, China. And we're going to talk to him about aspects of China in the context of its anniversary. Professor, welcome. Glad to have you.
Thank you very much for having me.
So when you look at China and the Taliban, what does each want from the other?
China has three reasons for supporting the Taliban. As a matter of fact, quite frankly, what we think that China wants the Taliban to be in power is incorrect. China is reluctant to have the Taliban in power, but China has a policy of not being pragmatic. So it deals or does business with any government. It doesn't want or favor one government or the other. So since the Taliban is in power now, first priority would be stability, especially in the Afghanistan, considering the presence of Uyghur and ISIS and the hotbed of terrorism. So that's the first priority. And we can discuss later on why China behaves like what it does. Second is that BRI. That would also be extremely important. But considering that if Afghanistan is unstable, whole of Central Asia can become unstable, that is also a worry for China. So BRI is important, but stability of Afghanistan is the key to that. Of course, third, there are geostrategic, geopolitical reasons, access to Europe, access to other parts of into Iran, and spreading BRI there. So that is also important, but that is all secondary. First is to make sure China is stable and Afghanistan is stable.
And what would the Taliban expect from China?
Taliban would, first of all, want diplomatic recognition. Second, it would also want to use China's UN Security Council seat. That's common sense. That's what a lot of the dictators in Africa have also thought about and used somehow. Third would be investment in rebuilding or nation building, and that is something what China has promised. Of course, that will all come once Afghanistan is stable, but China would be and is reluctant to invest straight away. The situation or Chinese perception of investment in Afghanistan is the same as it was before the US withdrawal, and now it is the same. So even if you look at after 2001 or between 2001 to 2020, China has made investments, but the investments have backfired. There's not been much return. They did not understand the ground realities, the factions and the warlords, and how certain warlords are not working with the government, and the frictions. And it's a political economy of conflict, which was the reason why it has burned its fingers, and it's reluctant to do it again.
Now, it's more than 50 days since the Taliban came in and seized Kabul. And there is no indication whatsoever that the international community is going to recognize. In that sense, do you think perhaps the Chinese may have overplayed their hand, or perhaps they were backing the wrong horse, perhaps they were expecting too much?
I don't think they were expecting too much, because as mentioned, even the Chinese are reluctant to have the Taliban back in power, because Taliban's connections with the Uyghurs in the ETIM go way back in 1997, where the ETIM was allowed to establish an office in Afghanistan, and then the ETIM is also supposed to have, or the leader, Hassan Massoum, was supposed to have met the Al-Qaeda leader, Osama bin Laden. And and he was also in the Al-Qaeda Shura Council. So China is reluctant, but as I mentioned, it's just pragmatic politics. It's realpolitik. If there's a regime in power, We need to do business with that regime. We need to ensure that Afghanistan is stable, irrespective of the regime which comes to power. So if it's Taliban or no Taliban, that's not the issue. That's an issue for India. Indian and Chinese perspectives of dealing in Afghanistan are very different. And maybe we can do a comparative analysis. But India thinks that Taliban is a problem. China also thinks Taliban is a problem. India thinks Pakistan is a bigger problem. China thinks Pakistan is a solution to the problem. And so does Russia and other countries, because that is the key backer for Taliban. So the differences, we also need to understand that China has a different thinking. It equates traditional and non-traditional security threats. India focuses on traditional security threats, also non-traditional, and it sees Taliban, if not Taliban, the Haqqani network in the Taliban, which is aided and abetted by the ISI, as a key player in the Taliban government at the moment, and which might conduct attacks, or the basis of Afghan territory would be used as a base for anti-India groups, which would then be sent after training to India. China also has the same problems, that ETIM might be, in cahoots, or somehow they are unable to stop the Uyghur militants from setting up or establishing camps or getting funding. But the way it is dealing with the problem is completely different. It wants to eradicate fundamentalism, extremism, radicalism, terrorism through economic growth and development. India's approach is through using sanctions and other coercive instruments. China's policy is not that. So there's a difference in policy. We can see that from the fact that China has said that it would provide aid, $30 million. It might go down. It does not want sanctions on the Taliban regime. It wants all the sanctions to be removed. It wants the Taliban leaders to be allowed to move. It wants the Western countries, especially the US and multilateral organizations, to release funds which the Afghan government can use. So they want stability, and they think that economic growth and development would provide stability in Afghanistan. We can say that there is something flawed with this ideology or this thinking, because Islamic radicalism the ideology is got nothing to do with poverty. Osama bin Laden is not poor. Taliban leaders are not poor. Yeah. But they think that the foot soldiers of the Taliban, who sometimes work for money, but a lot of them have been bred up in the madrasas in Pakistan and in Afghanistan. So the foot soldiers might be the ones who might leave terrorism or break away and go back to normal life. But I don't think that's going to happen because it's a political economy of conflict. And I think the Chinese thinking there is incorrect. But that is their thinking, and it's based on their own culture and experience from the past. But Islamic radicalization is different. Of course, if you look at ISIS, a lot of people who have become a part of ISIS in India, they're not poor people.
Yeah, they're not poor.
Even in Pakistan, college graduates, people from good families or middle class and upper middle class or higher class.
Bangladesh, yeah.
It's the same thing. It's so, and considering the fact that socially, culturally, Afghans are very different, especially Pashtuns. I think this ideology, this Chinese thinking might not work, but still, stability of Afghanistan is something which all countries want. We saw the BRICS statement, joint statement. We saw the SCO statement. They all want stability. They don't want Afghanistan to become a hotbed of terrorism again, not only in South Asia, but Central Asia and abroad, beyond the region. So there are a lot of convergence regarding what they want from Afghanistan, but maybe the paths or the tools are different.
Did the Chinese expect something that Pakistan would deliver?
To say that Pakistan would deliver, well, Pakistan wanted a government which in Afghanistan would be anti-India, or a government where Pakistan would have a lot of influence. Yeah. That is something which they've achieved. But to get international recognition is turning very difficult, and will be difficult for multiple reasons. First, it's a non-inclusive government. Yes, we have one Tajik, one Hazara, one Uzbek, but women are completely excluded. And that's a red line for Western countries and even for Russia, that you must uphold the rights, the gains that the women have made for the last 20 years in Afghanistan. And that is something which the Taliban will not compromise on. Taliban has already made or released statements saying that other countries cannot tell Afghanistan what to do. And they have no right to say whether inclusive government or should be formed in Afghanistan or not. So that is something which Pakistan would be unhappy about. But for China to believe that Pakistan would be able to deliver, I think that it would be something that would look good in Indian strategic circles, as I mentioned. China is not a big fan of Taliban, but if there is no other alternative, what do you do?
What do you do? Yeah.
If there is civil war in Afghanistan, that makes it even worse. If you have a running insurgency from Tajikistan, Uzbekistan into Afghanistan, that's even worse, because more and more terrorists from Afghanistan would went into Central Asian republics. And these terrorists, if they cannot enter China from Afghanistan, they would like to enter China from the Central Asian republics with which China shares a border. So there's a different thinking in India, but the way Chinese are thinking is very different. And we need to understand their concerns and the way they act. So if India says, we should sanction the Taliban, China would say, what do you gain from it?
Yeah.
It makes things worse. It makes Afghanistan more unstable. And do you want instability, or do you want a government which is pro-India? That's not going to happen. So Taliban is at the helm of affairs at the moment, and we somehow need to understand. I think it's going to be very difficult for Taliban to garner international recognition, because it would not be able or not be willing, especially the hardline factions, to make the kind of deal or make the kind of adjustments which they're supposed to make under the Doha deal.
Now, the Taliban are facing acute crisis domestically. They have no money. The economy is close to collapsing. There's a humanitarian crisis that's looming large. Would you see China stepping in at this point with some help of some kind?
Well, China has already said that it will provide US $31 million. That is something which they've said. They might have provided more. Maybe already. That, we don't know. It's not public, but who knows? Another thing is that they might have, they said they would provide 31 million. A lot of this is vaccines and blankets, etc. That is not going to help that much. What Afghanistan needs to prevent a humanitarian crisis is the international community to step in.
Yeah.
And even if the UN provides, let's say, $1 billion of aid, humanitarian aid, it's not going to last long. The population of Afghanistan is 36 million. Poverty line is US $1.95. So even if they spend $1 per day, 1 month, that's done. But again, 75% of the Afghan budget is based on foreign aid. So Taliban has to compromise, but whether the hardline factions are willing to compromise is a big issue. Hopefully, it might change, but if it doesn't, Afghanistan is in major trouble. Russia and China would want a stable Afghanistan, as all countries do, but whether they are willing to put in money at this point in time, especially through aid, is a big question mark. We'll have to wait and watch and see what happens within the next 2 or 3 months.
You think the Chinese accept the Taliban statements that their soil will not be used for terrorism against other countries?
First thing is to understand whether the Taliban would make a commitment and it can hold that commitment. Let's say the Taliban really does not want other terrorist groups to operate in other countries, but does the Taliban have the capacity
to enforce it? Yeah.
Issue is very simple. Taliban has been attacked by ISIS. Jalalabad, every day almost. They're not able to even control attacks against themselves. How do you expect them to control attacks against others? Same logic goes. The Chinese have been extremely unhappy with Chinese citizens being killed in Pakistan.
Yeah.
If Pakistan itself is unable to tackle terrorism in its own territory, how do you expect it to do that for others? So, and I've spoken to a lot of Chinese scholars on this, analysts, I've also published articles in academic journals on this issue, and they all come up with the same thing, that we do not think that Pakistan has the capacity to tackle terrorism, and for that, there's nothing they can do. They can't send Chinese troops in to fight terrorists. That's not what Chinese have done. And they would not fit in these social, cultural aspects. There are a lot of things. I remember what one Chinese ambassador to an African country said in the 1970s. I was there, and he narrated the experience where one of the African guerrilla leaders said to the Chinese ambassador, provide us with arms and ammunition, and we can fight. Don't come here, you cannot fight. You don't know the language, you do not understand the culture, the tribal aspects, and you'll not be able to fit in, and it will lead to more casualties. So same applies, because Afghanistan is, to a certain extent, like any African country with multiple tribes, multiple ethnicities, nationalities, languages, and culturally and socially they're very different.
So you would expect, perhaps over a period of time, as the ISIS steps up its attacks, perhaps the entire law and order setup right now, it's fairly tranquil right now, but it could get worse, possibly leading to other ethnic groups getting into the model?
There are three ethnic groups, which there are lots, but three main would be the Tajiks, which are after the Pashtuns the most dominant, then Uzbeks and Hazaras. The atrocities which have been committed by the Taliban in the past have been against Hazara Shia. I don't have to narrate the incidents, and if that happens again, Iran would step in. That has been something in the past. It almost went to war when 8 Iranian journalists and one Iranian was killed, diplomat was killed in Mazar-e Sharif, 1990s. And I've written an article on this, which has been published in International Politics, why Iran can be a spoiler. So yes, that is an issue. Again, Tajikistan will always have a problem. And last night when I read the news, Tajikistan is already complaining that non-inclusive government has been formed, excludes Tajiks, and there have been human rights violations in the Panjshir Valley against Tajiks. So that issue will always be there. The major issue is not whether the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazars take up arms against Taliban if there's no atrocities committed against these groups. The major issue would be if the entire population of Afghanistan faces economic problems. And that could lead to chaos and lack of order, because Taliban is very good as an insurgent group, but it's not good as a government. They don't have the experience, and they don't have the capabilities and capacities to enforce or fight this kind of thing. Even countries in Africa have this kind of problem. So a developing country which has emerged from a civil war, insurgency, political sciences will find it very difficult unless there's stabilization externally, but that is not going to happen unless there's a sort of compromise by the hardliners in the Taliban regime.
Would you see the Chinese being able to influence the Taliban to change their...
No. At this point in time, the country with which Taliban wants to establish relations is the US. They understand.
The US?
The US, because even yesterday, day before, and even before, they've been trying to establish relations. And if they establish relations with the US, they can establish relations with a lot of Western countries. It's simple. But until they compromise on the social aspects of the rights of women and inclusive government, and the Doha deal, which is basically inclusive government, and also not allowing any terrorist group to operate or target the Western countries, as I mentioned, it doesn't have the capability to do so. So we just have to wait and watch how the situation changes and whether the hardliners compromise, because the Mullah Barada group faction is more on the should I say, reconciliation. And reports came out which said that Barada was the one who mentioned that because there's a non-inclusive government, Afghanistan is heading for a civil war. So, and that is again something which I have written, which is coming out in the Middle East Policy Journal, understanding the domestic fault lines in Afghanistan, and the fact that women have not been included, the fact that the Islamic element has been established without the inclusion of the ethnic groups, and the fact that the Taliban does not have the capacity, maybe the inclination, but not the capacity to somehow stop terrorist attacks or terrorist groups from operating, would lead to major problems and maybe political, social instability, economic instability, and then civil war again.
You think the Chinese are very concerned about issues like women's rights and minorities, and it wouldn't matter to them very much, would it?
They are pragmatic. They will deal with any government in power, and that's how they think. I think India is also, to a great extent, not concerned about women's rights in Afghanistan. We're concerned about strategic interests. So the way Asian countries think and the way Western countries think we need to understand is different. So this concept of human rights or international society is something which is still lacking in Asian countries.
So last question. If things don't stabilize, as you mentioned, they don't stabilize the next couple of months, do you see Afghanistan again going down the path of?
It will take time. It's not something which is going to happen so fast. All countries would like to avoid the situation as much as they can. And they will take steps to ensure that Taliban doesn't again become a hotbed of terrorism and there's no insurgencies and civil war. Whether that happens or not is something we have to wait and watch. As I mentioned, India does not want civil war in Afghanistan or unstable Afghanistan. We want stability. Of course, it does not want a Taliban regime or maybe a Taliban inclusive regime which is not dominated by the Taliban or the Haqqani faction, a national reconciliation government. But that is again something which the Taliban have to look into. We here, sitting here, cannot tell the Taliban what to do. They have to make the decisions themselves, looking at the ground situation and whether the international recognition will come based on the non-inclusive government, etc., etc.
So test of wills on either side.
Test of wills, patience, and more important, maybe common sense.
Raj Varma, pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you.
And for all of you out there, continue to follow us on our web chats on YouTube. Do subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Instagram. Thank you very much. Goodbye.